Hello, I'm Marites Vitug. Welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. This is the show where I get to interview resource persons and newsmakers on issues affecting the region. I will be speaking to Georgi Engelbrecht of the International Crisis Group, or ICG. He is senior analyst for the Philippines, and recently the ICG released a three-part study on managing tensions in the South China Sea. I will ask Georgie about steps that countries should take to avoid a maritime crisis in these contested waters. Georgie joins us from Germany. Thank you so much for making time for this interview, Georgie.
Hi Marites, mayong buntag sa lahat or magandang gabi almost soon to the Philippines.
Wow, you really speak Tagalog well and
Konti lang.
Cebuano.
Yeah, gamay.
So let's first talk about the study, but broadly, Georgie, can you tell us what are the key recommendations to avoid crisis in these contested waters of the South China Sea?
Well, thanks, Marites. Well, we basically wanted to talk about this very, important point of tension right now in geopolitics and world politics from the perspectives of those countries that are actually the most arguably affected by the maritime disputes. So, in that sense, we have focused on Vietnam and the Philippines, as well as, developed a short regional overview giving the context, for example, about the US China competition and the rising tensions in the last years. So, with respect to the recommendations to the Philippines, they're also reflected, of course, in the piece on Vietnam and the other one. And I would encourage probably all the listeners to give it a try to read through the reports. I think they have some interesting tidbits. And I think, broadly speaking, especially for the Philippines, we can probably identify four main recommendations that we had. So, for example, for the Philippines, a key issue will be to really think about the dilemmas that it faces vis-a-vis, of course, China, the US, and the maritime disputes, and perhaps to develop a clear vision of its South China Sea policy, what it wants, what are its red lines, what does it want to achieve, and what is the way how to achieve so. I think it has something to do with the alliances the Philippines has currently in place, of course, with the United States, but also with the future of these alliances and the question whether it will continue the hedging course, as some would argue, of Duterte, or whether it would perhaps really commit to a more clearer position. And related to that is, of course, the aspect of modernization of the external defense, increasing capacities to secure the maritime borders. And while it wasn't a direct recommendation, it is probably something that Manila should be aware of and really perhaps develop a clear vision of how it wants to proceed. With the actual dispute, I think all of our reports highlighted the importance of risk management mechanisms. So perhaps we'll go into that a bit later, but there are several layers of conflict that could arise, especially also for the Philippines in the way it can be affected, whether by US China confrontation or tensions, whether by conflicts among the littoral states, right, including perhaps the Philippines, but also the big elephant in the room, or not even so much an elephant in the room, but the Philippine Chinese relations at sea. So I think we have seen that tensions can always be mitigated, but I think we still need more robust mechanisms to keep them in check. A third recommendation that we also broadly came up with is to deal with a general way how to deal with this dispute. And although we have seen that the code of conduct process is probably not at its best place, it is still something that is worth looking into. But apart from that, there was this other element that came out in various conversations we had about minilateral initiatives to bolster confidence between the claimants and really also not let the politics of the dispute overtake the issue, but really work together constructively on key challenges that we face in the South China Sea, but also more broadly, right? Like climate change and also the problem of overfishing. And I think lastly, what is also common is simply the value of diplomacy. because no matter how, extreme the tensions can get, how uncomfortable a situation is, I think it's still very important to talk. And again, for the Philippines, it probably is also an important point to consider given the tense environment it finds itself in.
So in your report, Georgie, you mentioned about and earlier you mentioned about the need for the code of conduct. But as you know, our foreign affairs secretary was quite critical of it. Said it's going nowhere, but it still needs the region still needs a code of conduct. And is this going to be parallel with the other recommendation you made on mini-lateralism?
I think so. I think, depending on what layer or frame of analysis we take for the dispute, we also might have slight divergent ideas what should really be the main point of action. So I think, of course, we know that the process had its flaws, that particularly when the research was started, like around 2020, many interlocutors I spoke to emphasized that at the end of the day, it is one of the few games in town. And I think even during this time, throughout 2020, when you had a lot of public attention on the West Philippine Sea, on the South China Sea, you still had even government officials referring to this instrument. That was also the time when I think the Philippines were really trying to achieve some momentum. But ultimately, of course, unfortunately, it hasn't really moved somewhere substantially. Now, Cambodia is ASEAN chair, and I think it is probably very, interested or at least promoting a potential agreement. But I'm not sure, again, how practical that will be. But that being said, I think it is simply a process that is right now on the table and is accepted by both the ASEAN members and also China. It has a history, and I think we also have the aspect of socialization there, where throughout discussions and interactions, the claimant states can actually, you know, also perhaps exchange views and have a common understanding of things, build trust, and not resolve the dispute itself, but really focus more on the managing tensions aspect. And I think one of the criticism that also goes towards the literal states is that they have differences that can easily be exploited by China. So if we think further and if we remove these differences, then perhaps the dynamic would also be slightly different. And perhaps we have some renewed hope for that because of developments that hopefully will come to fruition in the next months. But I still think it's a valid avenue, but it shouldn't be the only way forward, right? I think from the perspective of each country, you have to really have a different set of options. And I think in parallel, you also need to identify other ways. But as for the process itself, I think we shouldn't give up on it. Perhaps it's helpful to have, of course, realistic expectations, but ultimately, it's also good to really move forward in that respect.
What I understand, by the way, is in your report you recommend mini-lateralism, which means maybe you can explain what it means because not all the ASEAN countries or claimant countries or ASEAN countries will be involved in this mini-lateralism. And what's okay, maybe you can explain it first, and I'd like you to comment or I'd like to know your thoughts on the move of Indonesia to invite claimant countries to a meeting in February. So that isn't that one way to move forward. So please, your thoughts, Georgie.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that is a very interesting topic because, again, like as with some other recommendations, when we started doing the research, this idea or this concept came repeatedly up. It is rooted, I think, specifically for the South China Sea in the fact that we do have challenges along the code of conduct process. But it is also rooted in certain realities of governance, of maritime governance, that are certainly not going to go away. So, for example, we have the aforementioned issues of overfishing. I think by now we have enough scientific studies and estimates that are really presenting an alarming light on the situation. During our research, it became evident that the challenge is perhaps not uniform, but even at the coast of Luzon, we do see challenges with respect to that are rooted in the broader issue of fisheries. Not to mention climate change. This is, I mean, almost a truism to say how much it matters now. But I think the key element here is that the Philippines, as an archipelagic state, um, is also going to be significantly affected by this. And unfortunately, we have already seen signs of it, right? What happened with the recent typhoons. And I think even the fishermen whom we spoke to for the research emphasized that things have slightly changed in the last years or even decades. So this brings these common challenges for all of us, for all the claimants. And I think the question is now how to tackle it. And I think the code of conduct process may, of course, provide a way how to deal with fisheries cooperation and issues regarding environmental research. But perhaps there's another way that could be even more effective for the claimants and other interested states. So I think these two things come in together and create policy space. And in this policy space, the minilaterals could come in because, as such, minilaterals, I think, could be what we want them to be. I mean, if you look at the Quad or if you look at AUKUS, these are minilateral initiatives with a strong security component. I think apart from that, you can also have minilaterals that are either issue oriented, meaning a cooperation of countries regarding particular questions like fisheries, like environment, or they could be actor centric or actor specific. For example, the efforts of China and the Philippines to perhaps patch up the situation in Scarborough could be considered, a bilateral minilateral, so to speak. But I think the real drive behind this can be manifested itself within the South China Sea context slightly differently. So first, we can always have the claimants coming together and trying to put up a united front. But the question is, of course, what will be this united front? What is the exact objective there? And I think that's where the Indonesian proposal comes in. I think when we read through the invitation, one of the points was, well, let's share our experiences. But the next step, that will be interesting to see. Is it about a political meeting? Or is it about finding ways to simply boost confidence where all the literal states, not all of ASEAN, are involved? And in this context, we also have other existing minilaterals, for example, the trilateral cooperation agreement between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. I know it has been criticized on some occasions, but I still think that, it has an advantage because it was a formalized process that has the buy-in of these claimants. And in this region, it's not very easy to find something like that. Marine scientific research between Vietnam and the Philippines can also be considered such an effort, right? Where you join forces about a particular key maritime governance issue and go ahead. So I think at the end, minilaterals are in the eyes of the beholder, but also in the actions of those countries that want to move ahead. And I think in that sense, the meeting, hopefully next month, will be really crucial to watch because we have also seen some media reports, for example, that indicated it will be about Coast Guard cooperation. And this is precisely something that we would also need because we have gaps in the way how Coast Guards interact with each other. We have failed attempts in the past to come up with a system how to move ahead. So that could, apart from resolving the technical gap, actually again make the literal states work together, develop confidence, and actually think about proceeding further or in parallel with other governance issues. And I think pursuing that strategy could be really effective for some of the claimant states.
I was just wondering, Georgie, because we know that China likes to resolve issues bilaterally, and and it also is really focused on the code of conduct with ASEAN. So In your, I mean, research, how does China respond to these subgroupings or minilaterals? Are they open to it or dismissive?
I mean, in one way, like you said, by entering bilateral agreements, they already show at least some sort of um, willingness and participation in dealing with controversial issues. I mean, at this stage, for example, the bilateral consultative mechanism between China and the Philippines was one example of such an effort. Of course, it's not perhaps very multilateral, but it's an avenue that exists. And I think in the past, when you look at the delineations and the fisheries agreement in around the Gulf of Tonkin, we had also China and Vietnam that worked together. But of course, paramount for China seems to be the code of conduct process. So I believe a lot of the reactions will actually depend on the nature of the minilateral and also the way the claimant states are bringing it to the table. Because one thing is to cooperate on topics that are non-controversial, and most of these topics are in that realm. So I think, particularly given the geopolitical context right now, China would not have much to gain by making a lot of ruckus, and perhaps it won't. But if there are shades of, let's say, China's interpretations of these ideas having another layer, then that could be perhaps security oriented, then it could be complicated because then probably China will ask the claimants, well, can you specify what your intentions are? And what exactly is this initiative all about? And that's where we could have, a complicated situation. So I think in that sense, the literal states need to be smart because they definitely need to consider as well what China is thinking, but it should not be a factor that could prevent these policy interventions from actually appearing on the table.
Yeah, Georgie, in your three-part study, as you mentioned, you studied the Philippines and Vietnam. I'm just interested. Um, are there lessons the Philippines can learn from Vietnam in dealing with China on the maritime dispute? Because it seems that even if Vietnam and China are both run by communist parties, Vietnam is still able to stand up to China. But anyway, maybe you can share the insights that your research has found.
Well, that's an excellent point as well, because I remember during some of our conversations, I have spoken to some former government officials and also others who have emphasized that, yes, of course, the Philippines can have a look at Vietnam. But I think, as always, the devil is a bit in the details because although both countries have similarities and the overall objective is definitely, peaceful resolution of disputes, Vietnam and the Philippines, they differ in some ways, right? We have different histories, political trajectories, political systems, and also, I think, a different strategic culture. For many reasons, I think Vietnam has managed to have this vision that I've mentioned before. Whereas with the Philippines, we do see an oscillation between ideas. I mean, it's not new when President Duterte said we must have an independent foreign policy because obviously this is the goal for every country. But ultimately, if you just look at what was the policy under Gloria Macapagal, and then how it continued under Aquino, and then it went further to the current president, and then we have even the differences within Duterte's approach. That's where things become, really complicated. And this, I think, is slightly different from Vietnam's more or less, you know, clear approach that is not free of dilemmas. But I think this is one thing where Manila can also take some lessons, and it boils down to some of our prior recommendations, namely the idea of a vision for the South China Sea, for the West Philippine Sea, how to deal exactly with the big powers in this dispute, and what your own strategic culture would tell you about priorities. I think another important lesson from Vietnam is that Hanoi pursues a very multi pronged policy. So it has several options that it is using. Because obviously, putting your bets on one card will not result much in success. And I think even though the Philippines right now has also a variety of instruments, it would certainly not harm to, also think about the box, use the diplomatic way to raise issues, to continue perhaps filing protests and so forth, to not neglect external defense, because this is something where Vietnam is also showing it is committed to preserving its its fortifications that it has, simply because its strategic objective is territorial integrity. So we know that the Philippines have also reinforced some of the features that it currently occupies. But overall, I think perhaps in future this aspect can also be further increased. And one feedback I recurrently heard was with respect to Vietnam: talk, talk, talk. Again, this is a reflection of the recommendations on diplomacy, but Vietnam and China talk on absolutely various levels. You have the state relationships, you have also contacts between the parties, between the militaries, and of course, even provincial authorities to an extent. And I think this breadth of relations is probably something still a bit alien, quote unquote, to the Philippines, because one way forward could certainly be to increase its capacity in actually dealing with China. Um, Beyond the tropes that we sometimes see in the media and so forth, but really try to understand, okay, where is this behemoth coming from? What does it want? How does it operate? What can we do? And also having the language to respond to that. Obviously, Vietnam is predestined to deal with this relationship because of hundreds of years and even longer of ties and neighborhood. But I think the Philippines can also probably not forget that aspect. And yeah, so that would be it, I think.
Yes, it's very interesting in your report. Let's go to President Duterte. His term ends soon in June of this year. And your report says that his pivot to China may not have entirely paid off. Maybe broadly, how did you arrive at this conclusion?
Well, the interesting part in this research was that we started around the time the pandemic basically evolved. So initially, I was trying to go into trying to find an answer. What were the benefits of this detente? And of course, you can argue that there are two levels that you can measure Duterte's policy. Um, you know, vis-a-vis the Philippines. So on the first one is, how does it actually look with the situation in the South China Sea and the maritime tensions? Have they gone down? Was there progress? And I think that's where it starts getting complicated, because initially we had a relatively quiet sea, but it didn't stay for that long, because we had these incidents around Tito Island. We had issues with respect to Sandy Cay. We also had the Reed Bank incident and the public outcry it also caused. And ultimately, it further developed into the recent events, Witsun and Second Thomas Shoal. So, despite this high level contacts and despite good diplomatic relations, we couldn't really get rid of the tension. Of course, it could have been worse, but I think the result there was also rather mixed in that sense, because friendly relations were not fully ensured. And with respect to the logic of economics, something that people were hopeful or looked at as the lens into how to assess the president and his approach, well, that was probably also a mixed record. And perhaps for some people, that might be an understatement, because ultimately, we know how it started. The president having his build, build, build program, the idea to, getting really significant investments from China, the much cited memorandum of agreement worth so and so million. So when you look really down to the ground, yeah, some projects are in place, but they're just a few. The big things, well, they were not accomplished. And even though you had still a good direction with trade, with foreign direct investments and other forms how capital entered, it's probably not what both sides, or especially the Philippines, wanted exactly. Now, there are also other reasons behind that. I think that researchers have also, been focusing about. But I think even that shows the equation didn't really, you know, result in what Duterte wanted. But I also noticed during the research there was, a controversial assumption, or perhaps an out of the box thinking, that what if it was actually a plan of Duterte all along to force the hand of maybe the United States or other, entities to give him concessions, because the Philippines are very much needed in this current geopolitical contest. And they would cite the fact that the VFA saga, of course, finished with a positive result for the Philippines, but the Philippines still returned things, still got things in return. It got the, uh, various statements of the United States vis-a-vis the applicability of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It got support from the vaccine in terms of vaccination support. It received other forms of assistance. So you could, in theory, say, is this maybe the result of Duterte hedging? And I think, most probably would say perhaps not exactly, because it was not a master plan like that from the start, because he seemed to have sincerely believed in the way that friendly relations with China will bring something. And perhaps it was reality that finally has overtaken his thinking.
Georgie, before I ask you the final question, I just like to read two comments from our viewers, which shows how, well, at least gives you a flavor of a popular perception, maybe, about China. From Jomari Soquillo, China is the world's biggest enemy. And from Jenny Halem, good diplomatic strategy is different from cowardice, maybe referring to the Duterte policy. So, just to the final question, I remember you talked about red lines earlier. And in the early part of Duterte's administration, the red line, publicly announced then by Foreign Secretary Alan Peter Cayetano, was not to take control, for China not to take control of Scarborough Shoal. But of course, things have moved on, and in your report, you recommend clear agreement on fishing between China and the Philippines. What what are the specifics of this cooperation agreement? I mean, just broadly, maybe.
I think Scarborough is a very important, I think, point. I mean, it has been the reason for a very heated conversation and for very complicated events that date back as 2012 with the whole takeover. And until now, I think this influences the thinking of many Philippine policymakers and strategists. But in very clear terms, I think when Duterte assumed office, and then he got the support of Fidel Ramos in having these back channel conversations with China, they came up with this non-binding agreement, right? And that would have in theory allowed equal access for Filipinos to fish at the shoal. um, the arbitration award says that it has been a traditional fishing ground for the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and of course the Filipinos. And technically, the sovereignty about this feature is still disputed. But of course, we also know that there are some problems with the status quo situation right now. And I think a key challenge there is the arbitrariness of Chinese representatives on the ground in allowing Filipinos to enter either the shoal or the lagoon. For example, sometimes when we spoke to some fishermen, they say we don't even bother going there. We have to go to other areas. And that obviously results in socioeconomic challenges for communities that rely on fish, and we have also documented it. But on the other hand, we also have some who said, well, we could still, engage in some trade with the Chinese. We were able to fish around the lagoon, not inside. So, well, it could be better, but it could also be worse. For me, I think Scarborough is not perhaps exactly like the Gulf of Tonkin, where Vietnam and China negotiated over years to really come up to substantive fisheries agreement. Because I think in this case, it's really more about the access. And I think the fact that access is arbitrary and doesn't really exist also because Filipinos are prohibited from entering the lagoon, as it seems, it is very important to basically come back to the roots of Ramos's visit, and in general, what could these two countries achieve together so that there are friendly relations between them based on mutual respect. And I think China would not have much to lose by it. Of course, it may insist still on its claims to sovereignty, but I think the key issue here is really about access. But we know that Scarborough is also a strategic point for the Chinese, so now they also have to balance their own actions. Because looking at public diplomacy and looking at China's soft power, this is perhaps one of the reasons why Beijing, quote unquote, lost the Philippines once again, because it has not been able to shift rhetoric and action. And if you would just, adjust your behavior in certain ways, then perhaps the people would see, okay, we can talk to you. You're not the world's most evil power. But obviously, some perceptions are still in place because there's no shift in policy. And I think fishing, as it is an activity, that the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, and so many other peoples around the sea do, that could be really something beyond geopolitics where some agreement could come to fruition. But yeah, let's see how it will go. But I think it's really about the access variable here.
Yes, that's a key takeaway, Georgie. Actually, it's really access to of the fishermen, not to Scarborough Shoal. So on that note, and I think 2022 will continue to be exciting or contentious when it comes to the South China Sea, and we will keep watching your or looking for your studies or future research. So thank you so much, Georgie, for joining us, and to our listeners and viewers. South China Sea is always um, an interesting point of discussion here in Southeast Asia Speaks. So thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, salamat Marites. Bye bye.
Salamat.